Hello, everyone. Welcome in. Good evening. Apologies for the slightly late start, but just building up some anticipation for what is going to be a great training tonight. Also, apologies, my cats can't decide if they want to be in or outside of my room. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Welcome to our second training of our training series around building up electoral work in your chapter. My name is Christian Hernandez. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in North Texas, and I'm a member of the National Political Committee, as well as a member of the GDC Training Subcommittee, who is collaborating on this training with our National Electoral Committee. We are really excited about this training series in particular because of all the great candidates that we've been able to support and endorse nationally through our amazing National Electoral Committee. So you are going tonight hear a little bit more about how to build a field program specifically. Before we get started though, if folks can go ahead and introduce themselves in the chat, just give us your name, your pronouns, what chapter you're joining us from, so that we can go ahead and get to know who's in here. Make sure that you are, when you're sending your messages, that you send it to everyone. Otherwise, it will just go to those of us that are on the panel, and other folks won't be able to see. So welcome. I see some folks from California, got Atlanta, Las Vegas, Eugene, hello. Got Denver, amazing. Michael, hey, Texas is on the up and up. Really excited to have you here. Awesome. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If we can go on to the next slide. As people are continuing to trickle in, again, just make sure to introduce yourself in the chat. People would love to see where we're all coming in from. Just a reminder before we get started, how to be a comrade during this training. Be respectful in the chat, not only to each other, but to the facilitators who will be administering the training tonight. We like to keep it comradely in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A feature that is located at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. We will have some time at the end for questions. So again, we don't want to get it lost in the chat, so make sure to use that Q&A feature. And then we'll have some instances for engaging during the training. Feel free to share responses or feedback via the chat. We want to make sure that folks, take advantage of that space. We do have live transcription, excuse me. So if you need that, make sure to hit that live transcript button at the bottom. And we are recording this training if you are concerned about not being able to capture everything or just want to have it on hand to reference back to. So no worries if you can't say the whole time. We definitely encourage you to, but I did see that question already pop up in the chat about whether we were going to record the training. So we can go to the next slide. We're going to touch a little bit on our agenda. We're going to talk about doing your research when it comes to building out a field program, and then specifically creating a field plan and executing that, going into organizing your first canvas, phone and text banking, and how to engage your volunteers as we're carrying out this work, because we know many hands make light work. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jasmine, who is going to take us through the rest of the training.
Awesome. Thank you so much. My name is Jasmine, she, her, part of New York City DSA, specifically South Brooklyn. I've been involved in DSA since 2017 and have been doing electoral work actually since 2011. So I'm really excited to do this training with you all, and I'm really excited to answer some questions. But can we go to the next slide, please? So we're going to start about doing your research for having a good field plan. Next slide. So the first thing is obviously to choose a candidate that you're going to endorse. And each area, I'm sure, has their own process for doing endorsements. If you have any questions, if you haven't done an endorsement, if you have any questions, reach out to us. We can definitely, connect you to someone who's done an endorsement process before. But once you've chosen your candidate, it's really important to decide whether you're going to do a coordinated campaign or an independent expenditure. The difference between this is that when you're working with the campaign or are coordinated, you're able to communicate as much as you want with the campaign. You could work with the campaign, make decisions with the campaign, everything like that. Whereas if you're doing an independent expenditure, you're actually on the other side of a firewall, meaning that you cannot communicate with the campaign at all. There are advantages to both. We do usually recommend collaborating with the campaign. We also want the staff of these candidates to be DSA members, if at all possible. And you definitely want to enter some sort of data sharing agreement. But beyond that, there are so many advantages of being coordinated. You can have joint field events. You're going to get new members that come in and volunteer and join DSA who wouldn't necessarily know about DSA beforehand. And you can really, like with the campaign, come up with like a day-to-day strategy as the campaign progresses. The advantages of doing an IE are really legal and financial. Just for an example, DSA did an IE on the 2020 Bernie campaign simply because of the legal status of DSA. We would not have been able to spend more than $5,000 to legally coordinate with Bernie. And that includes things like, pizza and pens and like printing literature. So we would have blown through that $5,000 right away had we decided to do a coordinated campaign. But most campaigns, especially local ones, tend to be coordinated. Next slide. Thank you. The next thing to do is to calculate your win number. So the win number is how many votes you need to win the election. So the first thing, obviously, is to figure out how many people you're going to expect to come out and vote. This you can do by looking at similar elections in your district and figuring out how many people voted. If there are more people registered now than there were before, you might want to increase that number based on that. But what your win number in a two-person race should be 50% of your expected turnout plus one. In a 3 or more way race, we don't have any like scientific method for that, but generally we strive for 40% plus one. So if you have if you're expecting 10,000 people to come out and vote, and there's a 3 or more way race, you need 4,000. Your win number would be 4,100. And the goal is to identify 1 to 1.5 times your win number in positive IDs. So I'm going to use the term positive IDs a lot going forward. Positive IDs are registered voters in your district who tell you that they're going to vote for your candidate. Next question. And by the way, I'm not looking at the chat at all, and I probably won't until the end. So if you have a question, it's best to put it in the Q&A because I will be able to look at that in between sections. Great. So the next thing is to create your universe. What is a universe? A universe is the people that you are going to be talking to within your campaign. The universe can change throughout the campaign, but usually stays the same within any particular phase. And your universe is a combination of people that you think are going to vote for you and people who are just going to vote no matter what. So prime voters is a term that we use for people who have voted in a primary before. There's double prime, triple prime, but you definitely want to include people who have voted in a primary in your district before, whether or not they're going to support you. These are people who vote, so we need to talk to them. And then supporters. These can be people that have recently registered to vote. These can be people who you did when you were doing your issue campaign, you identified as supporters of DSA, Bernie supporters, whatever it happens to be. So your universe does need to be at least 150 times, if not 200 times your win number. So let's just, in the example that your win number is 5,000 people, your universe needs to be at least 7,500, but shouldn't be more than 10,000. The reason for this is you want to be able to use your resources wisely. So if it's more than 10,000, it just gets harder to talk to all those voters. And if it's less than 7,500, you simply don't have enough people to talk to, because not everyone is going to, that you talk to, is going to vote for your candidate. Next slide. Thank you. So the next thing you want to do is prioritize your precincts. So you want to find comparable races, either the Bernie election or any other left candidate, and you want to divide your precincts into 3 categories. These categories are swing, enemy, and base. So your base, these are people who are, this is an area where you're likely going to get a lot of support for your candidate. So we define that as a projected left vote of 60% or more. The next people that you're going to focus on equally as your base is your swing. These are people who really need to be persuaded, that you really need to have a conversation with. And that's defined by people who had a 40 to 60% projected left vote. And then finally is your enemy turf. These are people who are very likely not going to vote for your candidate. This is an area that you would not prioritize, although I'm not saying that you shouldn't go there at all. So this would be people with 40% of less of or less of it as a projected left vote. Next slide. So this is an example of a swing enemy base. I'm sorry, of a district showing the swing enemy and base turf. This is just a good example to look at when you're creating your field plan. Again, it doesn't, you're still going to go to most of the turf if you have the resources, but it's really important to know where to prioritize. And this is all that I have on this first section. Can we get a repeat of what a win number is? Yes, a win number is the number of votes that you expect that you need to win the election. So if it's a two-way election and you're expecting 10,000 people to show up to vote, your win number would be 5,001. And then we kind of just use 40% plus 1 for a 3 or more way race. Great. So moving on to the next section, creating a field plan. So next slide, please. So some best practices to just keep in mind when creating your field plan. So you want to cover the universe at least 3 to 6 times. If you finish your base and swing turf, you can move on to a secondary universe, but you want to make sure that you're hitting your base and swing at least 3 to 6 times. And you want to create a turf cycle where you're hitting turf most effectively. So what I mean by a turf cycle is looking at your physical district and deciding how you are going to canvass within that district. A few things to keep in mind is the difference between the base, the swing, and the enemy turf, and also geographic barriers, things like a major highway or anything that would make it difficult for someone to walk from one end to another. The reason to do this is so that, one, you can make sure that you're hitting the turf at least 3 to 6 times and that you're going to one place before you go on to the next place. It's also to make sure that as you're covering the turf, you're not going to the same place within 2 days, that you're spacing it out correctly. And also making sure that like you're covering your base and your swing turf before you start going into your enemy turf. And the way you want to look at it that also is kind of like dividing your district into these sections, and making sure that you're cutting turf in a way that makes sense. So like north to south or east to west. And I'm going to cover what cutting turf is later. But basically, what you really want, and you also really want to have like a Google spreadsheet or an Excel sheet with all of the election districts within your district, so that you're able to define what section you're looking at, and you're able to input those election districts in Van for when you're cutting turf. We have a really great turf cutting training that people can watch and attend. So if you're not totally familiar with what I'm talking about, there are resources to help you. Finally, just the last point about the turf cycle is it's really important to cut from like north to south or east to west or whatever you decide, so that if you're doing a canvas on a Friday night, but you're going to go back to that same area Saturday morning, that you could start cutting the turf on the other side of the district, or continuing from where people are tonight, and you don't have to worry about going to the same turfs that were already hit the night before. Another thing to keep in mind is to have kickoff events to build strong teams and to recruit more volunteers. These events tend to be as big as possible. This is where you pull out all of your resources to get as many people as possible to come to these events. You want to have some like really good speakers, if possible, including the candidate, drinks, and just make it a lot of fun. This is a really good way to bring people into the campaign. People who haven't canvassed before, or people who are not necessarily DSA members, might be a little bit hesitant about just coming to like a random event, a random canvas event. But by going to one of these big kickoff events that are big and fun and social, they're more likely to come back to the smaller events. And I recommend having a kickoff event for each section of the campaign, which we're going to get into more specifically in a couple of slides. Finally, you want to make sure that you're planning for GOTV, which is Get Out the Vote. Get Out the Vote will start in an area that does not have any early voting or very little early voting. GOTV starts just 4 or 5 days before Election Day. And the point of it is to make sure that you get the people who you've identified as supporters to actually go out and vote. If you're in an area where early voting is a thing, you might want to start your GOTV effort 2 or 3 weeks before Election Day. You do want to push people to go out and vote during that 2-week period, not waiting until Election Day, but you're also identifying new supporters while you're doing your Get Out the Vote effort. Whereas regardless of whether or not there's early voting, the last 4 or 5 days are really focused on getting people you've already ID'd to go out and vote. Next slide. Someone asked a question: where can we find voting records and get the best swing and enemy numbers? What are the costs associated with this data? I don't know the answer to this question across the board. I know that in New York, you get this from the Board of Elections. It doesn't cost anything, but it can be quite annoying because you might have to go to individual counties, but maybe we can. I'm not sure if DSA has a resource. I don't know the answer to that question, other than my personal experience in New York. Okay, so the campaign calendar. There are 4 phases of a campaign. First is pre-petitioning. This is work that you do in the community before petitioning starts. And this will usually look like an issue campaign where you integrate the candidate into the script or into the conversation. An example of this would be canvassing in a neighborhood about how housing should be a right, or housing for all. Having these important conversations with voters, and then letting them know that, hey, this candidate's running for office. They support all of these things. Can we count on you to vote for for Mike for assembly. And this is a good way to get IDs before anyone else has hit the ground, which is incredibly valuable. The second part is petitioning. So getting getting the candidate on the ballot. The number of signatures you need and the timeline is different in every state, but it's generally a 5-week period that ends about 2 months before Election Day. And your goal generally is to get 2 to 4 times the number of signatures, and to talk about the candidate while you're getting the signatures. Petitioning tends to, and this should be part of your field plan, petitioning tends to happen a lot on the street, doing street canvassing. And you might be able to expect to get about 10 signatures per hour in a busy neighborhood, but you can't expect to get a lot of IDs. Whereas if you're doing more door-to-door work, you can expect to get a lot more IDs per hour because you're having a one-on-one conversation. You're using data to know who's a registered voter, but you don't know, but you're not going to talk to as many people or get nearly as many signatures as you would. So part of your field plan should really be figuring out how many shifts you are going to need to hit your goal. This is just like, like a math exercise, like we need, let's say 5,000 signatures, and you just divide that by how many door shifts you can do and how many street shifts you can do to figure out, if you can allocate anything to street, or just generally have goals of how many canvas shifts you need per day through that period in order to hit your goal. And I would say always aim high, and never stop petitioning, even if you've reached your goal, because these conversations are incredibly valuable. Plus, everyone that you signs a petition should be data entered, and those people should become part of your universe. And if you have reach, which we're going to talk about shortly, you can really start identifying voters right then and there, while you're petitioning. Next slide, please. The third part is persuasion. This is again door to door with some phone banking where you identify supporters. Part of your field, this is usually an 8 to 10 week period from when petitioning ends until Election Day. Part of your field plan should be how are you going to get to your ID goal within persuasion. You should, think about use past data to figure out how many positive IDs per shift you can expect. I would say off the top of my head, about 4 positive IDs per shift is reasonable. And then you want to take the number, your win number, and divide it by how many IDs you can expect to figure out how many shifts you need in order to win. And part of that is also just knowing that you're going to start small and grow. Your first canvas, even if it only has 5 people, doesn't mean that every canvas is going to have 5 people. That will continue to grow with good retention, which we're going to talk about at the end of this. And then finally, GOTV and Election Day. GOTV means get out the vote. And the goal of this is to confirm supporters and make sure that they actually go out and vote. Part of this is actually having getting people to do a vote plan where they tell you when they're actually going to go out and vote. Next slide. Another thing is using VAN. VAN is a really important tool in order to do this door-to-door outreach. DSA chapters can access VAN through our national organization tools, but this is all about training for VAN. Candidates, I think that all candidates need to purchase their own VAN account, but you can learn how to do everything that you need to do with VAN beforehand. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but if you're unfamiliar with VAN and you are going to be running a campaign, do reach out for training because it's pretty easy, but you just need to get familiar with it. Next slide. So contacting voters, this is the most to least effective way of contacting voters. Relational organizing is the best way to get the best supporters. This is talking to people that you and your other volunteers know. You're going to get the highest rate of return, but you can only go so far. You only know a certain amount of people in your district. So then the next valuable is door-to-door door-to-door canvassing. Door-to-door is, great because you're able to have like a real one-on-one conversation with people where they're at and move them up the ladder of engagement from, maybe just finding out about your candidate to getting them to support your candidate. Phone banking is also very effective, but not quite as effective as door-to-door canvassing. And text banking, you can reach a lot of people, but you're not going to get a lot of positive IDs from that. Next slide. The last thing to keep in mind is coordinators and leads. You're gonna have to have leads run these canvases on a daily basis, and you're gonna need coordinators who are going to make sure that everything on the back end is ready to go. That means Van, that means scripts, that means literature, etc. Leads are the people who make sure that the canvas runs well that particular day. I'm going to talk more about coordinators and leads when we're executing the field plan. So that is it for this particular section. There's just a couple questions I want to answer. How involved would the candidate themselves be for petitioning and canvassing, especially in smaller communities? I think that as far as candidates' time is concerned, the most important thing for them to do is call time to make sure that they're fundraising and reaching the goals that they need financially. And the second most important thing is knocking on doors, and petitioning. There's like a theory that the candidate themselves shouldn't witness the petition because if there's any scrutiny, it might hold them up in court. That's a decision that you can make, but they should be out there talking to voters. Someone asked, is 5 to 7 positive IDs per person? Is the 5 to 7 positive ID per person in the shift? It's per turf, I should say, but it's actually much lower than that. I would say it's closer to 3 to 5, at least in New York City. It could be higher in other communities. I'm not sure. You should definitely experiment and see what works, and you might have to adjust your field plan based on that. And then are there survey response limits, number of survey limits for Van? I don't believe that there are, but you want to make sure that you're being very cautious about the questions that you're using and that you're using the same questions to ask the same questions. Like you don't want to have several survey questions that are asking the same thing because then your data might get a little bit messed up. Okay, cool. So I'm a little bit behind, but not much. The next part is executing the field plan. Next slide, please. So setting up a relational program. So you want every volunteer to talk to their friends and their personal relations. This is more effective than talking to strangers. So holding a friend bank event where volunteers can get together and call friends is a really great way to kick off a relational program. You should also really consider purchasing something like Reach to allow volunteers to easily add their friends. Reach is a program where that you use your smartphone. You can look up a voter based on either their name or their address, and you can identify them as a supporter or not. And you can actually take that data on the back end from Reach and put it into Van, so you can add those people to your positive IDs, which is a really great tool. And it's also really great to use during petitioning, like I said before. Next slide, please. The next thing is next important thing is to create a canvassing script. So canvassing scripts, it's very important to keep in mind that these are an outline on how to have a meaningful conversation. They're by no means something that people should read word for word, but the goal is to give volunteers guidance on how to make a connection with the voter on what issues move them. You want to start with a single wedge issue and how your candidate's biography makes them credible on that issue. And keep it short and sweet. Throughout a campaign, you may want to eventually let canvassers kind of pick their own issue, but you want to make sure that you're testing out each issue in the field. For instance, if you have a candidate that happens to be really good on housing, education, and healthcare, it's okay to have like options for canvassers based on what resonates with them, but make sure that you're testing it out in the field beforehand. But one really important thing, even though this is a guide, is to make sure that you're teaching folks to use the hard ask. Can we count on your support? Can we count on you to support Jasmine for Assembly District 43, so that they can have a real answer, yes or no, which you can record in your data. Next slide. So this is an outline of a potential script, and this is available for anyone to use. You could also just have it as a regular piece of paper. I've seen some really pretty ones. This isn't the prettiest, but this is just a basic thing. So you start with an introduction, talking about the candidate, how great they are, or if this is persuasion, talking about the issue. And then you're going to get into a yes or no question. And this is a simple question like, have you ever heard of Mallory Stage, who's running for office? And then, an if yes, if no, if unsure response to that. Then part 4 is like really the meat of the conversation that you're having. And in your script, this should kind of be like leading questions in order to start a conversation. So an example of this would be I forgot what name I used. I'm going to say Mallory Stork. I like that name. I don't know why. So yeah, I personally, I know in this community, a lot of people's rent has been going up. It's making it harder and harder for people to be able to stay in the community. Do you know any people who've had issues with their landlord? Or do you know anyone who had to leave their apartment because of increasing prices? This is the area where you ask those leading questions to get into a conversation. Once you have that conversation, you move into the how we will win, assuming that they're on board with you, which like they almost always are. Like, yes, so I totally hear you. Housing really should be a right, especially in a place like this where we have so much housing available, but right now it's for the rich. That's why we need people like Mallory Stork to be in our assembly. They're going to fight for us. They're going to represent us, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have the ask. Can we count on you to vote for Mallory Stork? And then ask 2 is something like, can we count on you to volunteer, or can we get you to come to this future event? But again, this is just an example. Fill it in however it makes sense for your campaign. And also you'd use a very similar script for a phone bank. Next slide. So another thing that you want to keep in mind is the leadership structure. You want to have as many leads as possible. So kind of going into what I was talking about before, you have a paid campaign staff, you have DSA volunteers, you're going to have like the super volunteers who are part of the coordinator team that collaborate on a regular basis, that make sure that everything is prepared. But then you also have leads that deal with the day-to-day operations of the Canvas event. And you want to have as many leads as possible. There's no such thing as too many leads. Not only do leads lead the event that day, but they also canvas and they also lead by example. So it's always really important to keep that, to have as many as possible. Have an easy way, and it's also an easy way to have people take on more responsibility. I recommend, depending on how big your DSA chapter is, you should have weekly, maybe every 2 weeks, or monthly lead trainings. So it's very easy to identify someone and say like, hey, you've been doing a great job. You should come to our lead training this Wednesday, and make them and actually turn them into better organizers. And you also want to make sure that you delegate responsibility as much as possible. It makes your life easier. It makes people better organizers, and it creates just a better overall structure for your campaign. Next slide, please. Awesome. Sorry, I just need to breathe. I've been talking a lot. Cool. So organizing your first canvas. So here are just, so next slide, sorry. For setting up the event, you pick a location and a date. Weekend, afternoon, and mornings are good in a public park, for instance, is good. If you're out there in the suburbs, you can have it at someone's house. The only thing I would say is, one, you do want to make sure that there is a bathroom accessible somewhere, even if it's like a Starbucks or a McDonald's. And two, you want to make sure that it's not some place where people are going to like decide to sit down and like order something and like take time out of the canvassing shift. Another thing is you want to make a spreadsheet of tasks. This is also a material that is available, like really just like a list of everything that you need to make sure you have prepared for your canvas. This includes like supplies that you need, things that you need to do with Van on the back end. Just make sure that you have like a checklist and you know who is doing what. The next thing is outreach. You want to phone bank your members. I would say you want to text your members. And, you know, this is especially for these big kickoff events, like your first Canvas should be a big kickoff event. You want to really pull out all of the stops and contact people as much as possible, and make sure that you are able to do reminder calls. The average flake rate for any campaign is about 50%. Like 50% of the people who RSVP are just not going to show. But that actually goes up to like 75% when you make reminder calls. Not only do reminder calls remind people to come to the event, it also shows them that they're like part of a bigger community by like but you're doing the work, they're going to be doing the work too, which is really awesome. And then make sure that there's something fun or social before or after the event. Again, this creates community. This gets people to want to come back to our events. Next slide, please. Another thing to make sure you're doing is the back end of Van. You want to prepare the turfs. And again, we have more information on how to cut the turf. You want to make sure that you're creating a script and adding survey questions and activist codes. The script is not like the same thing as like the Canvas script. The script is like a list of questions that you're asking the voter. You can actually put in the text so that people can read it off of their phone, but I find that it's better to give people a paper script that they can reference as needed. But the script in Van is literally just the questions that they're supposed to record. Activist codes might be something that you want to add if people are like interested in a particular issue, or just any sort of data that you want to retain that's not can we count on you to support this person? And then you just want to prepare to use Minivan. Make sure that you know how to download it on your phone. Make sure that it works, all of that stuff. Next slide. Thanks. So preparing materials, you want to have packs of lit, usually, 50 to 60 pieces of lit. Oh, something I forgot to mention before, when you're cutting turf, turf should be about 50 to 60 doors. If you're in an area that's really rural and it's hard to get between doors, you can make it less. Or if you're in a city where the doors are really close to each other, we have a problem like in New York where the doors are not only close to each other, but like you might have 10 people in one building and you can't get into that building. So you want to have a bigger one for the city. And you want your lit to reflect about the number of doors that you're cutting. You want to have sheets with the turf number on it. When you cut turf, you have the option to print out a map that has the Van turf number on it, which is really great. And you also want to write your phone number on the piece of paper, or get folks to write your phone number down before they leave so they can reach you if they need to. Make sure that you have a script, a frequently asked questions sheet, a data sheet if you're not using Reach, and make sure that you have, all of the things that you need. Clipboards, pens, hand sanitizer, masks, refreshments, etc. Next slide. You want to make sure that you have a sign-in system. If you're in a place with internet, Google Forms is good. If you don't, paper is totally fine. You want to make sure that you have COVID safety protocols and that that's well communicated between everyone involved. For kickoff events, you want to have an intro and a few speeches, but keep it short and simple. Most events are not going to have speeches, and you only really do introductions if it's a small group. You want to do a training. I'll get into the training, but the idea is to help volunteers feel confident and do mobile support. when I'm doing a training, I tell people if they haven't learned if they don't know how to use Van or Reach, to go to other people that are like stationed to help with those particular things. And then at the end, you want to make sure that you have a really good debrief. You want to make sure that volunteers feel really good and comfortable about what they did and that they come back. Next slide. So training volunteers, we just want to make sure that people are feeling comfortable canvassing. They help volunteers understand the basic information. It's really important, though, that trainings are only 5 to 10 minutes and that the training doesn't end after the training. Let people know that it's really okay not to know everything. And someone who really feels like they need more, just pair them up with someone who feels a little bit more comfortable. Next slide. So the basic training structure is starting with a motivation. Why are we here today? What are our goals? Just get excited about what we're doing. The next is to set expectations. It's really important for people to understand what a realistic goal is. If people haven't canvassed before, they might not know how many people they should expect to talk to, how many positive IDs they should expect to get, signatures, etc. And they might feel like they're doing a bad job when they're actually doing a fantastic job. The next thing is to go over logistics. Things are like Van or Reach, or going over this, the actual like 1 through 5 scale if you're using that, basic the information that you're recording into Van. And then finally, you want to go over the script. You want to explain the structure of the script. You want to model the script, and you want to let people get an opportunity to practice the script with a partner. Next slide. So finally, the last section I'm covering is phone and text banking. So next slide. To organize your first phone bank, first thing to keep in mind is there are predictive dialers that you can buy, like services that you can buy. These services are good if you have a big phone universe and you're expecting a lot of volunteers. But for these services to be effective, you need to have at least 5 volunteers calling at the same time. That's just how predictive dialers work. You can also cut a list in Van where people can enter the information directly into Van and dial from their phone. Again, create a script, make sure it's short and simple, and make sure the phone bankers are doing a hard ask. I usually have people hang out on Van. I'm sorry, hang out on Zoom during phone banks. People who are calling, put it on mute so that if people have questions, they can ask the trainer either in the chat or vocally. Next slide. And then organizing your first text bank. You can buy a service. This makes like texting like so freaking easy, and it's usually worth the cost. Or you could set up a survey through Van. I think Van does texting, but I'm actually not totally sure. You want to write a short script. It should be very brief. Pick one wedge issue. Test it out by texting it to yourself and to friends, because you don't want to create like a really big, long, scary paragraph. And you only need a few volunteers if you're using a service. It's literally just clicking a button and responding to people who answer you, and you don't really get a lot of responses. If you're not buying a service and you're doing it with your phone, you can have a few more volunteers, and it still definitely is worth doing. So that is all that I have prepared. I'm going to pass it over to talk about volunteer engagement. And then I don't see any other questions here, but we will have time to answer questions at the end.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. I'm sure everybody, I feel like everyone's just really like soaking all of this very important information in. And so for the next part, if we can go to the next slide, it is super important that as we're carrying out this work, we are thinking about like our most important resource, which is our volunteer time and how we're actually going to carry out this work. So anytime that we have an event, it is super important to do the follow-up. I personally think it's the thing that's most often overlooked. There are often very many people who are ready to like give back, ready to hit the pavement. And if they do not get that direct ask, that hard ask of participating in a campaign or an event, they're not likely to come out, to turn out. So making sure that we're constantly inviting volunteers, both after the event to social events, future volunteer events, and really making sure that they're plugged in and not assuming that because we posted it on social media or that we've, sent it out as part of a newsletter that people are aware of it. We want to make sure we're constantly making those touch points. We also want to celebrate recurring volunteers. I think it's super important that people know who is returning, who is really motivated to hit a bunch of doors, and who is really looking to, play a big role in this campaign. I think it's always great to be able to celebrate people as they're contributing their most valued resource, their time. And then also as people are coming in, I think it builds up the confidence for us to be able to delegate tasks to those people who start coming in on a regular basis. It's always good for us to be looking at IDing who could potentially take on a leadership role, whether that's by first starting off with some smaller tasks, then building up to, say, a shift lead or a captain that could then really take on some of that work. And I think the more that we're delegating the amount of work that needs to happen, the better use of our time. We can go to the next slide. And as much as engagement is important, we also want to be able to retain our volunteers and make sure that we can count on that as a consistent source in the course of our campaign, but also in the course of building relationships with people who may or may not be DSA members as a way to get them plugged into the organization at large. So you'll want to make sure that retention is important because we want to understand our volunteer need. And that's going to be rooted in your research based on like your win number, your doors knocked, your positive IDs. What does that mean for our capacity? What does it mean for what number of volunteers we need to be able to sustain the work we have to do in order to win the campaign, in order to win the election? And so the more recurring volunteers that we have, the more confident and effective your volunteers will be. It's always great to be able to, it can be a little daunting to show up to an event and you don't really know anybody, but if you're someone who's gone again and again and you see the same faces, it really starts to build this sense of community and this sense of belonging that I think is super important in order to be able to keep on these recurring volunteers. We want to make sure, again, that any calls to action are clear on all of our social media, at all events, with all of our comms. We want to be super effective and, continue to drive the message home of what is it exactly that we are asking volunteers to help with. And then as far as, what sort of the 4 buckets of retention to keep in mind, appreciation. We want to be publicly thanking people, making sure people have what they need. Sharing people's stories is always a really compelling way. I really appreciated, the Bernie comms team for constantly sharing stories of volunteers and like why they were actually there. I think that's a really motivating way for people who maybe are like on the fence about participating to show up and not only that, but to stay because they feel a part of like that important network. Comfort, volunteers who are comfortable with this work will put voters at ease. They'll convey confidence. And I think that's super important, especially because it's not every day that you're knocking on strangers' door, asking them, to vote or asking them to get involved or asking them about their lives. And so we want to take this unique opportunity that we have to have a really robust political conversation with someone you're meeting for the first time. And the more that we're doing it, the more that we'll feel comfortable in this space, the more confidence that will be conveyed when we're having these conversations. Achievement, making sure that we know why people are volunteering, root them in what is driving our collective work. We want to be building up our leaders. So that also means recognizing volunteers with the number of doors they knocked or the shifts that they've done, maybe incorporating a leaderboard for your volunteers so that, folks feel a sense of not only belonging, but a sense that like things are getting done. Because while it might be obvious to you, like the progress that is or isn't happening within the campaign, it is important that volunteers also recognize that like the small things that they're doing on an everyday basis or however often they're volunteering is making a huge difference. And then lastly, of course, community, building that sense of community creates both loyalty and buy-in, and makes people feel like they are a part of the win, which is super important. And then, you know, what sometimes happens where people end up running once, they lose, but they run again and win. It is super important that people feel bought in. So that sense when they run again, they're like, hell yeah, I knocked so many doors last time. I'm going to knock even more doors this time. And then, of course, most importantly, we want to make sure that we are making the ask, that we are getting people signed up for that next event, and keeping people in that continuous loop of understanding what is at stake and where we can plug in. So that's pretty much it for volunteer wise. I think we have a little bit of time before our training ends. So if folks have any questions, again, the Q&A is open. I also want to take a quick moment and let Mike, who has been running our our chat and our slides, to introduce himself, because he's a very important person in the organization when it comes to our electoral work. So passing it over to you, Mike.
Hey everyone, Mike Keehan out of Austin, Texas. I am the chair of the National Electoral Committee. Yeah, definitely want to plug everyone. Same time next week, we're doing one on communications and crafting good messages, you know, getting your message out to voters. So that'll be a really good one and a really good complement to this one. So I hope people can show up to that one. And then I'm just going to drop my email in the chat. Definitely, if you have questions, email me. I sometimes take a little while to get back. I know a couple of you emails, but I will answer them. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. And again, you know, from our previous training, we did encourage folks to review the NES, or the National Electoral Strategy. I think it's a very important document for DSA's electoral work. So encourage folks to read through it and think through with your chapter, whether that's with an existing working group or one that you're just starting out, as to like, how does that apply to your local context? What does that mean for the vision for your electoral work? Are you doing ballot ordinances? Are you running candidates? You know, are you just sort of trying to get the lay of the land? That's going to look super different, but I definitely, again, encourage you to reach out to the NEC, who can continue to help support and guide chapters, as well as, you know, taking some notes from what's happening currently with our national elected candidates. If you haven't already, I'm going to make the pitch to donate to our national elected, national endorsed candidates, because they definitely can use all the support of DSA members, whether you live in their area or not. Because again, this is collective work, and a win in Boston, a win in Austin is a win for all of us all across the country. So it does not. Okay, yes. So one of the questions was if we had a PDF manual of this information, or if it is the slide deck. I believe we have some handouts that the NEC has put together, particularly in respect to our last training, if you missed that. And I think we should be able to share those slides in a follow-up email for folks. Great. Any other questions? All right. I think we are good then. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Really appreciate y'all staying engaged, the great questions from folks. And again, we'll reiterate, join us for the last training of this series next Thursday, same time. And you can register at the bit.ly that is included there. Super props to Jasmine for covering a shit ton of information, but very, very important. So if you feel like you missed anything, be sure to watch out for the recording, so you can go back and look over it. And again, feel free to reach out to the NEC for any questions about your electoral work. All right. Good night, comrades. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
Good night. Thank you.
Yeah, if you want to, Mike, we can debrief really quickly. I think Jasmine hopped on.
All right, let me text her real quick.
Okay.
But yeah, I felt great about that one. I thought Jasmine really did good.
Yeah, I mean, I was like, how she got through so much information.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think people really appreciated, again, it's always to me really obvious when someone has like that. I think people really picked up on that.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hey, we were just talking about the sheer amount of information that you covered in quite the short time period. It was very impressive.
Thank you. I hope I didn't talk too fast. No,
I thought you were great.
thank you.
Yeah, I think the pace was good. You'll know, people will always post in the chat like you're talking too fast. I actually really like the trick I've learned is whenever we have live, oh, hold on. Let me stop